Hello, thank you everyone for being here. We are having a very beautiful panel today. It is about Indigenous women then and now, and it falls underneath our Her Frame Matters series. Before I give it over to our wonderful moderator, I will be giving a land acknowledgement. We acknowledge the land we are meeting on is the traditional territories of many nations, including the Mississauga of the Credit, the Anishinaabe, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat people, and is now home to many diverse First Nations, Inuit, and Métis people. In thinking about what I wanted to speak today, the one thing that was very pertinent was about the fires burning, especially because of being a person based in Toronto. It was the first time in a while in which, the climate issues are affecting people based in the city that don't necessarily think about that. And something that I see missing from a lot of the conversation is about, if we want to think about environmental justice and climate change and the push for a better future, what has to happen is an understanding and centering of those who've been fighting for that. And that is Indigenous people. Even if you just think about the last 10 years, forget about the past 100+ years, those who've taken the risk, those who have fought for our collective, freedoms, those who have been talking about the importance of being in relationship with land, above capital, above all those stuff, have been Indigenous people. And sadly, those who are feeling those impact the greatest are them. And when we think about the next steps moving forward, I don't think there's any way to really think about, climate justice and fighting for a world that is better for all of us and all our descendants. And not thinking about making sure that the stewards of the lands, the people who fought for it, are centered, and land back being a very key component of that. I'm now going to give it over to Tanya Brunel to introduce the panelists and have this amazing conversation. Just please remember that we'll be having a Q&A at the end, so make sure that your questions are in the chat and we'll be bringing it up. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Welcome, everyone. I'm happy you can join us today. My name is Tanya Brunel. I'm Métis from the Red River region in Manitoba, and I'm a producer based in Winnipeg, Treaty 1 territory and homeland of the Métis Nation. I have been developing and producing award-winning documentaries, documentary series, youth series, feature films, and drama series since 2001, and I will be your moderator for today. I do want to acknowledge Real World Screen Institute and the work that they have been doing. Real World is committed to using research, measurement, and industry engagement to create mechanisms that hold systems accountable for greater equity. And past research works include racialized sexual harassment, the intersections of race and gender in 2019, and the Changing the Narrative report in 2020. Both of those have been instrumental to the industry at large in increasing the access and representation of Black, Indigenous, Asian, and people of color in the Canadian screen industries. They recently launched the Her Frame Matters, which is an industry-wide research project addressing stereotypical depictions of Black, Indigenous, Asian, and women of color in Canadian film and TV. The project will produce a research-backed protocol guideline that will support creatives, producers, and executives on how to better create authentic portrayals of these women. Our panel today, Indigenous Women Then and Now, is going to discuss some of this research, how women have been treated and depicted in the Canadian screen industry from the beginning of their careers to now. And we're going to talk about generational shifts, community-focused storytelling, and I will present some of the focus group findings from the Real World Screen Institute research report. So without further ado, let's get to it. I will let each of our panelists introduce themselves, starting with Loretta Todd.
I'm here on the unceded territories of the Squamish people in Gibsons, BC. I'm so honored to be here today. I am a filmmaker, producer, writer, founder of the IM4 Lab, an Indigenous XR Lab. I just like to tell stories. I believe that's really my gift in life, is to tell stories. So hi, thank you.
Thank you. And Tanis.
Hi, Sorry, I have a little barking dog where I am right now. Tanse, my name is Tanis Peranto. I'm Métis from the Métis Nation of Alberta from Region 6 in Peace River, which is up in Treaty 8 territory in Northwest Alberta. And I'm an actor, been an actor for many, many years, and now an emerging producer as well.
Thank you. And Darla.
Hello, Tanse, everybody. My name is Darla Kantwa. I am a Cree Soto actor and writer, and I'm currently in Winnipeg, Manitoba.
Well, welcome everyone. So let's get into it. The Her Frame Matters survey and focus groups asked 3 main questions, and we'll get into some of those questions throughout this conversation. But I wanted to start off with, overall, the participants we're talking about change in the industry, and participants were able to identify a few positive changes, but overwhelmingly, everyone from all racialized groups, not just the Indigenous panels, mentioned that bigger efforts need to be made to have a diverse, inclusive, and equitable screen-based industry. So with that in mind, maybe we'll start with you, Loretta. What has been the biggest change, or has there been change over the course of your career in how you're treated as an Indigenous woman in the screen sector?
There's the systemic issues, and then there's the individual issues. So the systemic issues are such that the industry is an industry, and its primary purpose is to make money. And where they think there's money, they'll go. And so now there seems to be money with our stories. But what happens when they don't, when they change their mind? So I think the change that I've seen, and it's a long, hard fight, because, I'm going back to the beginning, is to basically say, well, no, we need our own industry, for lack of a better word. We need our own sovereignty of our image and our storytelling. And I think that's the change. And that change has been long coming. I mean, we've been talking about that right from the very beginning. When I started making films, we were shouting that, off the rooftops. And I wouldn't necessarily even say it was being listened to within the industry, but I think it's being listened to within Telefilm, CMF, those sort of organizations that are actually the financing source. There still changes need to happen, but I would say that's the biggest change. Individually, I've always been on the outside, and that's been both a strength, and it's also been a challenge for me. So the industry tends to like team players, even though I know filmmaking is all about working in teams, but the industry sort of wants people to kind of like go along, and I've never been one to go along. So individually, I would say it's been a struggle. And then that's just in terms of my own work. If you're talking about the representation of Indigenous women in media, we'll get into that, I guess, on that. But I always have to bring my own traditional values to this as a Cree Métis woman, and that would be that I have to always still be very cognizant of being grateful for the opportunities, and grateful particularly to my grandmothers and grandfathers, because I wouldn't be here without them. So regardless of all the industry obstacles or all the industry things, you have to stay focused as an Indigenous filmmaker to realize that you're here for a different purpose than just being able to participate in a rather, how should I say, industry with much baggage. So anyways, that's my short answer.
No, that's great. And, Tanis, for you as an emerging producer, how do you feel some of the same things that Loretta feels about change in the industry? Do you think we're in a different place as you're, starting to produce content now?
I feel like I haven't gotten into it too much to experience any kind of shift or look back and compare yet. I feel like I'm really just getting started, because I did start producing 8 years ago, but that was just getting friends together to make short films and to produce short screenplays by an Indigenous writer friend at the time. And I took a break from that after a while. And then during the pandemic is when I started I got like bit by the producing bug again and started to look into all the funding that is available by the CMF and Telefilm and the ISO and everything as a Canadian, as an Indigenous producer, and as an Albertan as well. So I feel like I'm a little too emerging still to comment on that.
So Darla, for you, in your perspective as an actor and a writer, how does, when we're talking about positive changes in the screen industry, as, a writer and an actor, do you feel that there's been any sort of shift, or is it the same thing? You're still a little bit too new?
I feel like that's a really difficult question because like my background is mainly in theater. Like I've been doing theater for 15 plus years, and just coming in and doing Little Bird, I feel like was a very unique experience because Little Bird was such a monumental series in terms of like Indigenous women leadership, in terms of the support system that was available on set, and in terms of like the story that we told. So that's really my only experience. And the fact that Little Bird got made, I think, is a good sign, but I feel like there's still a long way to go.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So one of the things that participants noted was that there's been an increase in the number of Indigenous storytellers and mentorship programs that train Indigenous talent, but that these programs are quite often implemented by the Indigenous producers, not necessarily the non-Indigenous producers. What have any of you seen that? Do you agree with that? And I'll leave that open to anybody who wants to take it.
I guess I'll just pop in. Actually, last night we honored the late Barb Cramner at Cinematheque, and we showed some of her work. And, I remarked that back in the day when I was still at film school, I was lonely and wanted to create community. And so I was lucky enough to be friends with the late Len George. And we started a program in honor of his father, Chief Jen George, and people like Barb Cramner and Tracy Kimbono and Ruby Dennis and Marianne Jones and other people. It was about 10 people in the class. They took a one-year program to production. Of course, it led to these people having these opportunities. I've always looked at it as not as training. I think that's always been one of the kind of obstacles we have to overcome. They keep thinking, well, you still, even I went to film school. I got out of film school and I was still told I needed training. I was still told that I wasn't ready for this or I wasn't ready for that. When that wasn't sort of the same standard that was put on, I found other filmmakers. I don't think we really need training. I think there are people who are emerging, coming up, who are going to go to Shirley Choo has amazing training institute. There's many, organizations, the Indigenous and Independent Digital Film Program at Capilano University that Doreen Manuel ran for a long time. There's so many programs out there that, we people are already training. And then people like, hopefully every Indigenous producer out there is also hiring all those people without having to be shamed publicly, because some people have had to be done that way. But I've been hiring from the very beginning, Indigenous crew. So I never looked at it as training. I always looked at it as life experience, its opportunities, its work, just like the industry would. The wood industry, I realize there's hierarchy within the unions, and unions have trainees and people move up in terms of permittees and so on. But I think our approach is a little different. It's like you learn by doing, as much as you need that background and you need the foundations that you can get in a class. But I've hired people who didn't have any experience, and give them an opportunity to find what their talent is. So I think they have to, the mind switch within the industry is that we're ready. And here I'm talking as somebody who also created the IM4 lab, which is an XR lab, and we've been training people in AR and VR and now virtual production. And with the idea that I don't want to play catch up. We were always told we had to catch up in the past, and now it's like no, we're leaders. These are our lands, these are our stories. We're the leaders, and I think that's the kind of switch that needs to happen in the industry with respect to training. And I think the other thing that happens, and I think that's a problem within Canada in general, it's not just applicable to Indigenous filmmakers. It's Canada in general has a kind of a different standards. There are certain people who will be forever the Cronenbergs and you know the I can't remember some of the filmmakers, you know, will forever be able to have access. But there tends to be this thing where, you know, you make a few films and okay, you had your chance, rather than letting a filmmaker evolve and, you know, continue to create stories and contribute. And, you know, particularly in the Native community, you know, we call that, you know, anti-energy. And, you know, I think that anti-energy is really critical and important to this industry because, you know, we're bringing that life experience, we're bringing that tenacity, we're bringing the kind of subtlety that comes from, you know, many hard won battles and, you know, the kind of things that, you know, we've had to go through. But at the same time, like I said, that the guidance of our grandmothers and grandfathers sort of putting us in this is why we're here. I think that, you know, needs to flourish. That needs to have, you know, more depth and more breadth in this industry. So yeah, I don't know. I mean, I think training, yeah, I'm not discounting it. I'm just saying it has to be switched. The word has to be switched. And we have to be seen as full partners in the industry and not some people who are just catching up because, you know, it's technology. And of course, Indigenous people don't know about technology. So there's a whole mind shift that has to go on. And I mean, I've encountered that from the, many times over. Yeah. Anyways, that's my I could probably go on, so I'll stop.
Well, we do only have an hour, but and we do have a lot to get into. So I want to touch on one of the questions that was asked through the Her Frame Matters research was, who do you believe has the power to influence change in these depictions? And most of the respondents, overwhelmingly, it was the networks and producers. So what do you all think of that? Who do you believe has the power to influence change? Tanis?
Yeah, I would agree with that. The people who have the final say in the hiring all around, whether it comes to which writers are being brought in, directors, and definitely producers are usually the ones who have the final say with everything. So I completely agree 100%. And then bringing in more, if we're telling Indigenous stories, bringing in Indigenous producers to tell those stories.
Darla, who do you believe has the power to influence change?
You know, the writer in me wants to say the writers.
And that's valid. It's valid.
But I feel like you can write all day long, every day. You can write the best scripts in the world, but you're still going to have networks and producers that say no to you. Do you know what I mean? Like, for example, Squid Games, like the most popular TV series on Netflix, took like 10 years for somebody to even want to make that. And I was like, so I go back and forth.
So one of the things, when we're talking about networks, the introduction of streamers and alternative platforms like TikTok have really disrupted the industry and sort of changed audience viewing habits. So what do you think the impact on Indigenous content is as a result of that disruptive change? And I'm going to give this one to Darla because out of all of us, she's the one with the most TikTok followers and posts. So I'm going to throw this one to you.
Can you just say the last part of the question again?
Yeah, I mean, what do you think the impact is on Indigenous content and creating change in depictions by having platforms like TikTok, which are open to any creator to create content without sort of having that overview of a traditional broadcast or network?
I think that TikTok and social media and all of that allowed people to really see what we're like on the day-to-day. And I think that, like, for the most part, Indigenous creators are sharing their humor and they're letting people have insight into what it's actually like to exist today as an Indigenous person. So I think that really shifted the narrative in terms of most major content out there in the past has been focused on us existing in the 1800s or the 1700s and all of that. So I think that really created a change there.
And what about the, in having a platform like TikTok reaching, a wider audience, a different audience, maybe a younger audience, what about the power of audience in influencing change? What do you all think of that? And maybe it's not so much the broadcasters, if, Loretta, as you're saying, it's driven by eyeballs. It's driven by money and what's going to bring audiences to a platform. So what about the power of an audience in influencing change in some of these depictions?
Again, associate that question about, who has the power? We have the power. And I think that's one of the things that particularly UNDRIP, when the federal government, accepted UNDRIP. UNDRIP was meant not just for, land claims and treaty negotiations. It was meant for across the board. And so we're not isolated, working just with ourselves. We're working, for our people, on behalf of our people. And, I think that that's something that we need to, sort of mobilize. And I think that was the case, and with the case with something like Monkey Beach, where it was really, the Moccasin Telegraph, as we call it, that basically made Monkey Beach the #1 Canadian film for 4 weeks at the box office. So it was that kind of collective action that just going to happen spontaneously, like I say, the Moccasin Telegraph. So yeah, we have a big audience. Our audience is so regardless of what the census says, there's a lot of Indigenous people in Canada, and so that in itself is a block. And I don't think that the broadcasters in that have recognized that enough and supported that enough and realized that enough. But I also think if you apply UNDRIP, then the kind of decision making, and of course, we see that happening now with the relationships between CBC and APTN and so on, influencing those things. But it has to be broader. It has to be sort of allowing all inclusive. So there's many voices. So there's not just a few voices now. Okay, now these are the ones that made it, but so now the other ones are off the table. It has to be all the voices, which would come down to kind of the application of things like UNDRIP. But yes, the audience. I think I remember years ago. I know that you're not supposed to mention his name, but Sherman Alexie. I was saw a panel once where he had Maria Campbell, Lee Miracle, the late Lee Miracle, and Sherman Alexie were on. Can you imagine? And Sherman Alexie mentioned that in the States, one of the largest demographics that bought Indigenous books was white college-educated woman over the age of 25. And so those kinds of things, don't often get looked at as far as sort of the broadcasters and so on. And then there is, data is very big. So yeah, I think that we need to kind of be able to mobilize that, our people. And yeah, TikTok has definitely shown that there's a strong thing. I sometimes I think those are all great things. I do worry about our young people. We all want to become YouTube influencers now. And there's a kind of good side to that, or TikTok influencers. There's a good side to that because it talks about independence. It talks about, controlling your own image. But there's another side to it. I recently heard a discussion that was going on about how there was some people who were uncomfortable with the kind of mockery of certain Indigenous cultural practices by some influencers because it's humor, right? And so, I mean, maybe that's just some of people are too sensitive or something. But I mean, I think my ideal world, we would have our own platforms, and those platforms would be as vibrant and as and as and inviting, so there would be many people who arrive, rather than, as someone in my family once said, why would I want to be on social media to make somebody else a billionaire? So if we could kind of control that a little bit more, that would be my ideal, my dream.
Well, that's interesting because, the next part that I kind of wanted to get into is narrative sovereignty. What does it mean to you and how does it fit into this conversation when we're talking about tangible change. Tanis, what does narrative sovereignty mean to you, and how do you think it fits into this?
I think it just really boils down to us being able to tell the stories that we want to tell in the way that we want to tell them, without checking off a box for someone else, like Loretta said, without making someone else a millionaire. Just giving us that freedom, our inherent sovereignty over our own stories to tell. I really think it's as simple as that, and including us in other rooms that aren't just about Indigenous stories as well. Our voices and our experiences as Indigenous people, and just as the people as individuals, are just as interesting as any other individual. And I think being included on teams, on writing teams, on producing teams, on creative teams, just makes the story that is being told that much more richer, whether it's an Indigenous story or not.
Okay, I'm going to come back to that because you brought up something that I want to come back to. But Darla, narrative sovereignty, what does it mean to you, and how do you think it fits into this conversation?
I think that there's still a long way to go because, like Tanis mentioned, we're still in the phase of feeling like we're checking off a box for people. And I think that there needs to be more agency and more freedom in the things that we do and when we're allowed to do them. For example, I had a friend who worked in the theater industry, and she is Afghan, and she was going up to theater companies and saying, I want you to give me money to create my own work, and then I don't want you to ask me what I did with it. And I think that in itself is really powerful, because it's like, hey, when you give us money, there are so many things that we have to do in order to please you just to get that money. Why can't we just be trusted, to tell our own stories and do it in the way that we want to do it with the money that you give us? Do you understand? So that's like, that for some reason, like really changed my mindset in terms of trying to please somebody with the work that I'm doing instead of just making what I want to make, which is inherently Indigenous because I'm an Indigenous person. If that makes any sense.
No, it does. It makes perfect sense, right? And I think it feeds back into a little bit of what we've been talking about in being able to control our own stories and doing the work. And but I wanted to come back because there was one thing that Tanis mentioned that made me think, we're talking about, obviously we're a panel of Indigenous women, we're talking about Indigenous content, but what about, having us in spaces that's not just Indigenous content, right? Having representation in writers' rooms on a medical drama, right? That's not necessarily anything to do with an Indigenous story per se, but just having that representation in those rooms on something that's, completely different, or inserting characters into stories that it doesn't have to be an Indigenous story to have an Indigenous character, right? Tanis, maybe you can expand on that because you're the one who made that light bulb go off.
Yeah. And I love what you said, Darla, about whatever story you tell is inherently Indigenous because you are Indigenous. And I find that too, when I want to produce something and it's by an Indigenous writer, but is it Indigenous content in non-Indigenous people's eyes? And will I get the funding for it because is it Indigenous enough? Because are we bringing Indigenous things into it? Are we checking off those Indigenous boxes? And I would like to see more of that where we, as an actor too, like you said, Tanya, just being an Indigenous character, but it isn't about who that character is as an Indigenous person. That character just happens to be Indigenous or not, or casting Indigenous actors in non-Indigenous roles, which I don't see a lot of. And I've started to work in casting a little bit on the side too. And that's one of my biggest joys is casting Indigenous actors in non-Indigenous roles, because I feel like we need to see much more of that. Yeah, I think that we get put in a box no matter where we are in this industry. And I'd really like to see more change in that regard.
So, I mean, that brings me to the question of, through this Her Frame Matters, one of the questions was, what is one tangible change that could be made that would impact your ability to improve these depictions? So some of the responses were people being honest, more representation in all facets of production from money down, more representation across the board in all roles of production. And, I think, Tanis, you touched on it with what you just said, right? But I'll toss this back to Darla. What's one tangible change that could be made that would impact your ability to improve these depictions as a writer?
I think I'm just going to piggyback off of Tanis, because I've been saying this, and all of my teachers have been saying this for years since I started working as an actor, was I want to be an Indigenous person and just exist in a role and not have it specifically speaking about my trauma or specifically speaking about the historical wrongdoings that have happened in Canada. Can we not just exist and be people? That I think that would 100%, like, one of the big things that for me as an actor is really important is playing a contemporary Indigenous person. Like, I've kind of stepped away from those auditions that are like, oh, we want you to put on buckskin and we want you to paint your face and we want you to, only speak in an Indigenous language, which Indigenous language is important, but I would love to see Indigenous language played into a script that's about somebody existing today. Why does it always have to be in the past? And I think for me, that's something that's really important.
Loretta, what about you? What do you think is one tangible change that could be made?
Well, there's two things. Again, the systemic. The systemic is the fact that as Indigenous producers, the whole tax credit thing is still a barrier. Because as you know, to get an interim financing loan from the bank, if you're talking about big budgets, then you need what they call net worth, and you need to be able to access that loan. And we don't have generational wealth. We do culturally, we do spiritually, but we don't materially. So, we don't own that house that's worth $2-3 million, or most of us don't anyways, that then cannot be collateral so much, but a proof of your net worth with respect to interim financing. So I would like to see CMF and Telefilm or some place come along and say, look at, we're going to, Indigenous productions can have tax credits like 60%. I know they do that in some countries. I think they do it in Ireland, where the tax credits are up front. And so you don't have to go and get as big a loan from the bank. And I think that would free up so much production opportunities for Indigenous producers. So that's one thing. The other thing is I have done that. I created a series called back in the day, getting ahead of my time, I guess, a little bit, called Sky and Chang with the wonderful Cyrillise MacArthur and Olivia Chang. And it was two Chinese woman and an Indigenous woman ran a dojo in Chinatown, grew up in the inner city, and it was a sci-fi thing, and it was very much about their power. And I remember at the time people pitching it and people saying, well, they're so angry. Well, they're angry because, well, they're not angry, they're doing martial arts. They were doing martial arts. So there's still those sort of shifts, but I agree. There's I just think if there was more, and I hate to say this word, I'm not trying to shame people, but if there was more decolonized Indigenous producers who would make those leaps, I think we could make incredible move within this industry where we would be driving it. We would be the leaders.
So to come back to the Her Frame Matters, in the beginning we said overwhelmingly who has the power to make the change, and a lot of the respondents were the broadcasters and the producers. So one of the other questions to follow up with that was, do you have a suggestion on how broadcasters and producers can create fewer stereotypical female characters? There were a lot of really detailed responses to this one, so I'll just share a few of the highlights. But a lot of what it comes back to is authenticity. The authenticity of the team that is driving the narrative. So do you think, where does that come from? And how does community-focused storytelling help create maybe fewer of these stereotypical characters? Darla?
Well, I think it's really interesting what Loretta said, and I think that she's on the right track in terms of your identity plays a huge part in the stories that you create. And I think that if you stand firm in the things that you know, and your goal is to create characters that are not stereotypical, then if you're rooted in what it's actually like to, be that person or be that story, then I think ultimately it'll just come out better and more authentic and more real and more layered, because as humans, we're so layered. Like for me personally, I'm addicted to reality TV because you literally cannot write reality TV. It's so ridiculous. It's so crazy, but these are humans being humans. You know what I mean? I find it extremely fascinating. And I think that if you have a very strong identity in what you're creating and how you create it, then that will not be stereotypical because it'll be layered.
Mm-hmm. Tennis?
Yeah, I agree with that as well. And I think you use the word community, and I think that as much as it is a goal to have an Indigenous person on every team, like we talked about before, as a producing team, writing team, and what have you, having more than one is even better, especially when it comes to an Indigenous story. Sometimes sometimes as an actor, I'm the only Indigenous person on the whole set, or if you're the Indigenous writer, sometimes you're the only Indigenous person. Even like in our daily lives, sometimes we're the only Indigenous person around, and so there's a lot of educating that has to come with that, and the emotional work that you have to do to answer people's questions. And I feel like sometimes I personally struggle, and I have other friends I've talked to about this before. Like sometimes you don't even want to, like, you have to make that decision. Do I want to take on this emotional labor right now? But I usually don't, because it's so much. But then I feel like I have to. I feel like I have. I can't not, and so having the support of other Indigenous people around, I think is really important, and takes a lot of that stress and emotional weight away.
Absolutely. I think, that's a huge thing when we're talking about the emotional labor that we have to do on top of the work that we want to do, right? The work is the actor, the work is the producer, the work is the writer, the work is the director, having to bring on that emotional labor and the role of educating everyone around you. And, you don't have all the answers yourself. I mean, we're such a varied group of Indigenous people that my experience is different from everyone else on this panel. And so, you can't be the only one to speak for everyone. So Loretta, what do you think about that?
You're going to have to phrase the question just really quickly for me.
Sure. I mean, we're talking about authenticity, building a community around you in creating content, and the importance of that.
Well, I mean, I think one of them, as we were thinking, I was sort of on my mind. I think one of the things is that we need to ensure that we're doing programming for all Indigenous community, the parts of our community. So children and preschool and tweens and, and youth and, adults and elders, just like, within the mainstream. So they get to do programming for everybody. And so when you're doing lots of different programming, then just the sheer numbers are kind of like, I talk about it, what's that word they use? Critical mass.
Mm-hmm.
So the more work we're producing, for, I created a series called Coyote Science. It's about Indigenous science. And I always say it's for Indigenous youth, children and youth and their friends. So it's, and of course families, but it's, the idea is that bringing people into our sphere of influence, bringing people into our way of looking at the world through our programming. But at the same time, our first and foremost is reaching our own communities, our own, many generations and many types of people. I know that even, us Crave and APTN out here on the coast, we have to do a better job of making sure that, this is not our territory. And, the people here, the coastal people and interior people, they need to be able to tell their stories, and we need to support those opportunities as well. So I guess it's that kind of organic thing. It's of really having a groundswell. I mean, that's what would be, I think would be great if we could have that groundswell where, on every level, we're producing our work, and everybody just has to kind of catch up with us finally, because the kind of innovation that we bring to technology, the innovation we bring to storytelling, all those kinds of things would just, sort of pervade, the way things are done. So it wouldn't no longer be us asking them to be let in. They'd be asking us if they could come on board. So anyways, those are just some of my thoughts.
I love that shift. It's not about us asking them, it's them asking us to come on board with what we're doing and how we're producing content and what we're creating. I love that. So I think, we're coming up to the end of our hour. I want to make sure that we have time for questions, but I'm going to ask one final question of each of you. And that is, what is your hope for the future of Indigenous representation in the screen sector, either on or off screen? Tanis, I'll start with you.
My hope is to have an Indigenous show on every single channel that exists, every single network, every single linear channel, and even on the streamers. Like, I know that some people are for and against it, but Netflix has their certain demographics for certain channels, I guess, within Netflix for certain demographics. And I feel like that would be great to have, here's the Indigenous button, just press that one. And that can be on everything, Paramount Plus, Disney, all of it.
Love that. Darla?
Can you come back to me? I'm still thinking.
Yes. Okay. Loretta, what is your hope for the future of Indigenous representation in the screen sector?
Well, I guess it goes back to what I was saying, just this idea that, when we need the means of production, we need easy access, much easier access to financing and to those kind of, those structural things. And there needs to be more. I think there's only, I can't remember how much is in the Telefilm Feature Film Fund. And yes, everybody, we're so grateful, but there needs to be more funds. I would like to see this, and I would like to see more money toward the ISO, and I think that the ISO needs to have control. I think that they were administering it. They have a much better sense of dealing with our communities, and so I'd like to see the ISO sort of like leading. So that's my hope for the future, that will happen, and that they will have their budget increased by manyfold. I mean, when you think about it, this industry allowed certain companies to really flourish, because they would get multiple years of a production. Look at Murdoch Murders, it's been going on for years and years and years. And, we need those kinds of things so that our families and our people can actually make a living, and that's one of the things that's, I think, really, really difficult, is that, most Indigenous producers and filmmakers and storytellers and writers and crew even, struggle even to make a living. And that's, I think, really critical, is that we have that abundance, because this land is an abundant land, and so many people have got wealthy off this land, and we're willing to be much more respectful to how those resources are applied. So I would just like to see more resources. That's my hope for the future, that there's more resources, so there's many stories, so that that it's more inclusive, so we don't end up with just a few people being able to because the risk, not against any producer who's having great success, but the risk is that, well, okay, the broadcasters will say, okay, yes, you will look at that one's doing really well. No, as I think Darla said, every platform has an Indigenous program, but even more than that. And I would like to see APTN get more money too. I think APTN deserves to have a much bigger budget as well.
I agree. Okay, Darla, are you ready now? What's your hope for the future of Indigenous representation?
I think that for me, one of the things that is really important in moving forward. Kohana, quiet, please. Sorry, my toddler is here. Can you sit down, please? Give me that. Sorry.
No.
I think for me, one of the most important things is accessibility. And like Loretta keeps talking about, with the money being available and not having collateral for a loan, like I think that that's one of the things that needs to be changed and needs to that needs to be worked on. And in terms of the relationships between settlers and immigrants, and understanding the historical context with Indigenous peoples existing today, like I think that relationship needs to have a greater priority in terms of the stories that are going forward, because I think that Indigenous content is so focused on at least our stories and like us telling our stories, which is important, but I would like to see focus on the relationships that we have going forward in terms of, the different kinds of communities that we need to reach and we need to connect with, because there are still so many unhad conversations out there.
Absolutely. Well, all of you, thank you. This has been amazing. I think we could keep going and going and going, but I am going to open it up for any questions from some of our audience today. If you haven't yet, pop them in the chat, and hopefully we can answer them for you as it relates to this panel. And I'm just looking. Everyone's so shy. No questions so far. Okay, I'm going to. Okay, here we go. So we do have a question, and this actually comes into what I was just about to say is, so this question coming from Pete in 1980s, there's a correction below. African and international filmmakers, creating the African Filmmakers Committee. Do you think a group like that is needed in Canada? And I'll add on to this, because I was going to say we haven't really talked about the Indigenous Screen Office and how much of a game changer it's been for representation in our industry. It came into being in 2017, 2018, and it was the result of many, many years of advocacy and activism from, Indigenous professionals across this industry to have it become a reality. So do you think the ISO has been a game changer in our screen industry? Loretta, maybe I'll throw this to you, because you can probably talk about more times in the after times.
There has been many efforts to create a Indigenous producers or filmmaker organization, probably before my time. And then again in the 90s, Will Campbell started one. He actually created the Studio I, which is an Indigenous studio at NFB that for some reason the NFB decided to cancel. But it was, so there's been many efforts. We created the Aboriginal Arts Center at Banff, and that was another effort to kind of bring people collectively together around Indigenous storytelling. I know there was a producers group that, then back in 2005, and I suggest if everybody can get a hold of it, there was a report called At the Crossroads, and there was another Indigenous organization at the time that Jeff Bear was leading, and the group of us got together and did a research report that basically put forward some of the changes that we'd like to see and some of the systemic issues, which, by the way, still apply. So there's a lot of information and that. I guess the thing is, I think it's such a huge country, and there's people in Toronto, the people in Vancouver, and then everybody in Plains and the people in the North. So how do we kind of collectively come together? I think that's been one of the biggest challenges. And I left out Quebec and I left out the East, and that. So I mean, there's so many that's a big thing. But I agree. But I think those of us who have been trying it for many years, maybe it's time for some, other people to take it on and see what it could become. There are organizations that right now, I think it's called the Native, there is a group that's more based around nonprofit groups. But yes, the Indigenous Screen Office has really been a great screen. They really changed, because one of the things I think I really like about them is that, I am used to putting in proposals to CMF and Telefilm, but the amount of paperwork, required to do that is exhausting. And it favors companies that have staff, lawyers and accountants and business affairs people to do all that. I do that all myself with, an amazing line producer who I work with. But, so we're at a disadvantage to begin with. And I think what ISO recognizes that Indigenous producers are often working on their own, and they try to make it as streamlined and as accessible. And I think that was really, really key, because it makes you feel like you're being treated like, with respect and integrity. I think the CMF and the Telefilm system, it's not it's because within the Western way of looking at things, everybody's out to kind of rip off the system. So we have to put checks and balances in to make sure that that doesn't happen. Whereas I think there's a certain amount of trust that goes on within how we do business as Indigenous people. And it's sort of like there's that respect until, you prove that maybe you don't earn, maybe you need to go back and, earn some of that respect again. But there's a kind of like a covenant, if you like, that we're all in this together, and there's a respect for that and respect for our integrity. And intellectually, emotionally, that is a big change for as an independent filmmaker out there, sitting at your computer and, wondering whether, everybody's even listening to you. So yeah, ISO has made a big difference, and the people there, I have, a lot of respect for.
And I think that, what you mentioned about the ISO and how they changed applying for funding and the way that they're handing out funding speaks to what Darla was talking about, and just, trusting us with the funds to do the work that we're going to do, as opposed to jumping through all these hoops and checking all these boxes, right? It's just giving us those resources to do what we're going to do and create the work that we're going to create, and just trust that, we know what we're doing and it's going to end up amazing, right?
I'm going to throw in one question. I think we also have to leave room for bumps and failures, because I look at some of the people that I particularly in the arts, sort of more like the experimental video art or whatever, but still generally that, people were given a lot of space. I mean, there's things that, stories I can tell you what I heard, they're hearsay or anecdotal, so I probably shouldn't say them here, about the kind of latitude, even though I talked about these checks and balances in the CMF and Telefilm, the latitude for people to fail. And, and yet the kind of standard by which we're kind of held up to, I think that that's another thing, is that there needs to be that space, because that way there's many voices. There's no one Indigenous voice, as everyone's been saying here. There's many, many, many different types of voices, and there has to be space for that. And again, the ISO really does, I think, understands that.
Mm-hmm. So we have a few other questions. I'm going to share this one from Samira, and I think this is aimed at you, Darla, because you talked a little bit about relationships. So could you speak to those relationships? So much of how we understand each other, Indigenous and people of color, is through whiteness, and I'm so interested in works that explore that relationship, the good and the bad.
I think you hit the nail right on the head, Samira. I think that those kinds of stories are so underrated and so underrepresented. And I think that these relationships have been sort of kept away from us for a reason, because I think on some level in every community, we can relate to each other a lot more than we can relate to whiteness. Do you know what I mean? So I think that that's something that's really important moving forward, is building those relationships and telling those stories and creating this community where we can all work together in terms of it being only through the lens of, you know, whiteness, like you mentioned.
Mm-hmm. Let's see here. JG asks, how do we involve Indigenous filmmakers and avoid tokenism? Can we even do that? I think we touched on this a little bit when we're talking about, you know, authenticity and creating a critical mass of filmmakers and of people across all departments. But maybe, I don't know, Tanis, do you wanna take this one?
Sure. Yeah, I might need a little more context with that question, but I think generally, yeah, if you can involve Indigenous filmmakers without putting the burden on them to prove their indigeneity or show their indigeneity or add something Indigenous to the project that you're doing. Just let them be who they are.
Yeah, and I think, you know, when we're talking about how to avoid tokenism, it's really being able to assert yourself as the Indigenous person in that situation. You know, we've had it multiple times where we're partnering with a non-Indigenous producer, and they have certain ideas of how that relationship is going to go, and that they're going to be able to dictate the terms of the creative control and the financial control of a project. And coming back to some of the work that the ISO is doing, you know, there's a lot of resources that we can now share and point to, like the protocols and pathways guide and things like that, to sort of assert your position and saying, this is not okay anymore. And, you know, these types of things can't happen. You know, there's protocols in place. So I do think that there are ways, but part of it is to stand up to that and sort of own your place and own your voice in calling out that it's not okay. So we have about 3 minutes left. Let's see if we can take one more question. This is from Sky. These are great points on Indigenous creators accessing funding. Can the panelists speak to how they have personally overcome these barriers and the gatekeepers? I'm going to throw that open to anybody who wants to answer it. Or have you?
I'll just
maybe we're not there yet.
I don't know. I don't know if I'm the best at accessing funding. Like, most of my work that I've produced so far has been in theater. Like, I only recently started jumping into screenwriting. And I think that for me, one of the things that I've always relied on is my identity, like how we were talking earlier. And something that I feel really strongly about is speaking authentically and as honestly as I possibly can. So for me, I've just been focusing on merit. When I write and when I create and when I act and when I do anything, I always focus on the integrity, in the authenticity of my voice. And that's something that for me has worked in my career, is just trusting that I know who I am, I know what I have to say, and I am strongly rooted in what that is. So that for me has worked in terms of getting people to recognize my voice and getting people to recognize even my name and my face. That has made such a big difference for me.
Mm-hmm. Tanis or Loretta, do either of you want to add to that?
I think, well, again, being an outsider, I've always been, it's never been easy. I'm grateful for every opportunity, and I've had some, good opportunities, but it's always been, what's the word? It's just tenacity. I mean, I just never give up. And I think, I think people don't realize that, they expect you'll go away. They'll keep pushing you down, and, eventually you'll go away. And I never do that. So I think that's, but although sometimes I wonder whether, is that just me? Is it something I'm doing to make them do that in the first place? But I don't know. I think that, again, I think it's that critical mass, the more of us, the more it will, that they can't keep saying no to everybody. And then again, if we control more, then again, I think that we'll see more of an opening. But I don't know. I guess the challenges is it's that I mean it's a word that the dear Leroy Littlebear uses, the sphere of influence, that bringing them into our sphere of influence, and so that they then do business in a different way as well. So it's not just like I said about them coming to us, they're coming to us now, but also them changing their mentality, because that mentality that has to change. It isn't just about the film industry and representation. It's about as the started at the beginning. Sophia, I hope I'm getting her name right, if I can remember that, it's about the land, it's about the environment. It's about, our non-human living, relatives. So we're not just doing this so that we can have a credit, on the film. We're doing this because we have to, live up to our responsibilities, and that includes, the land and everything in the land. So we have to that's bringing that sort of sphere of influence to change the mentality of all Canadians, so that we don't have to see our Wet'suwet'en and brothers and sisters fighting for their territory, and being harassed by AK-47s. Okay, maybe it's not AK-47, but definitely guys in SWAT, just to live on their land. I mean, that's we're still fighting those battles, and so whenever we can bring them into our sphere of influence to change that mentality, I think. I mean, even in a small way, I think that's a good thing.
Well, thank you so much. I think that's our time, and it's a great note to end on. Bringing everyone into our sphere of change, right? And that's how we'll make it work. I want to thank all of you for joining me today. I want to thank all of our audience for participating in this conversation today. And I do want to say it's not too late. You can still join us in creating awareness about the gap that exists in integrating Black, Indigenous, Asian, South Asian, and women of color into a subtler and nuanced representation on screen, in fiction, and make a change in bridging racial and gender equity in the Canadian screen-based media industry. You can sign up to be a part of Real World's research project addressing stereotypical depictions. We want your opinion and participation in our research and events through surveys, interviews, focus group discussions, panel discussions, or our mentorship program. The link to the Her Frame Matters is in the chat. So once again, thank you everyone for joining us today, and we'll see you next time.
Hi, thank you so much. No, so nice.